What's up, everyone? We have Yoeri Pegel, head of strength for AFC Ajax Football Club and former strength and conditioning coach for the Dutch men's basketball 3-on-3 national team, as well as their regular basketball team. Yoeri and I have met this past year and have had several conversations regarding basketball. He's been a huge sounding board for me and has challenged me to think more critically about a lot of things. So many of you in the US might not know of him, but I'm happy to bring him to this episode. Yoeri, can you introduce yourself and tell us what your favorite shoe is?
Oh, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's been some very long conversations. I believe the last one was about 3 hours in length, where it was scheduled to be one. So that's a summation of how we usually have our conversations. My favorite shoe all time is just going to be the black cement threes. Classic. Can't go
Okay,
wrong. I've had about 5 pairs by now, so got to be up there.
nice. And then can you just give us a little bit more about a brief intro to your background as well as how you got into basketball?
Yeah, so I'm now 29 years old. I work as the head of strength, like you said, at AFC Ajax. So for those who don't know, that's soccer or slash football. My background as a strength and conditioning coach or performance coach, physical prep coach, whatever you want to call it, is primarily in basketball. That's where it originated from. I got my degree in business. From there, I personally started to get into athletics through CrossFit, so started to do national level competitions here. That got me into the whole training methodology, the whole training sphere, basically trying to optimize my own process. Before that, in my teenage years, I'd always played basketball, but from a skill perspective, I was deficient, and from a physical perspective, I was probably even more deficient. So that was just never something that I could really aspire to do as a professional, although I always wanted to. I never had the talents for it. So got into CrossFit, a lot more talent for that. So that I actually was able to do at a decently competitive level. That really grew my interest for physical development because that's a sport that's dominated by, the physical nature of it. From a tactical, technical perspective, it is far less demanding than a sport like basketball. But from a physical perspective, that's where it's dominated. So that really got me into that sphere to the point where eventually I started coaching, so interested in my own process that you then, out of enthusiasm, start helping people that might not want to be coached, but you do it anyway.
Yeah.
Started doing that, got to working with general population over time, started working with athletes. That turned into my return back to basketball. And my first role, literally as a strength and conditioning coach, was thrown right in the lion pit, basically, by becoming a head of strength here for Apollo Amsterdam, which is a professional club or semi-professional, as basically half the players get paid and half the players probably didn't at that time. But a national level professional basketball team. From my experiences there, I went over to a bigger team in Den Bosch, same league, but one that was vying for the title. And then from there, it starts rolling a little bit. So I got introduced to the Dutch men's national basketball team, and then the 3-on-3 Dutch men's national basketball team. And with the latter, we were able to qualify for the Tokyo Olympics last year, which was the first time that a Dutch basketball team had ever qualified for the Olympics. Of course, there's a difference between 5-on-5 and 3-on-3, but for either sport, it was the first time. So that was a pretty big milestone. And I had split my time up between the 3-on-3 team and AFC Ajax the past few years. And as of this past summer, I had transitioned fully into football or soccer because of my current role at Ajax as head of strength.
So it definitely sounds like you've had a wide range of experiences, especially working, with a lot of sports, whether it's been soccer, fighting. Is it
Yeah.
MMA fighting or is it boxing?
I've actually worked with boxers, MMA, and with kickboxing. Yeah.
And then CrossFit. So, I mean, that's like a wide spectrum of sports. So, that's something I want to touch on later. Is like, what have you taken from those sports and applied it back to basketball? But back to the main point, which is, when we talk about the Fergus Connolly's kind of four coactives, physical prep would probably be your main domain. Obviously, understanding tactical, psychological, and
Technical.
technical. Yeah. Duh. Technical, which is what I do. uh, can you talk about this concept of reverse engineering the sport and how you look at how you reverse engineer basketball, basically?
Yeah, so I think if I were to answer that question, you start by introducing the concept or what the term reverse engineering sport demands actually means. And basically, this process entails every athlete or every sport has inherent demands. So for the game of basketball, those demands, for instance, are from a physical perspective, running, changing direction, jumping, shuffling, various different physical demands that are inherent to the sport. Now, for instance, a lot of these are similar to other field or court-based sports, such as tennis or volleyball or soccer, American football, etc. So a lot of these are actually similar, but there are definitely some unique characteristics to every sport. Now, those characteristics from every sport are, I wouldn't say dividable, but they are, you can break them up into your technical buckets, your tactical buckets, your physical buckets, your psychological. And as one of my good friends, Nick DeMarco, says, you can also look at it from a cultural perspective. Which is something that I've personally also ran into working in different sports, how much of a factor that truly is in your ability to communicate effectively. But again, going back to the point is, all right, we have this sport and this sport has inherent demands. Now, in order for us as sport coaches or as physical preparation coaches to prepare our athletes for that sport, we need to prepare for the demands. We can only prepare for those demands if we understand what those are. So if we don't understand what, in this case, physical actions or sporting actions the sport consists of, it is very difficult to train for it, which is basically, again, going back to my experiences working in different sports. If I don't understand what the sport asks or demands of my athletes, it is very difficult to prepare them for it. So that's basically the concept of reverse engineering the sport demands, is first understanding, okay, what's demanded of our athletes? And then secondly, if we know that, X, Y, and Z are asked or demanded of our athletes, how do we now prepare them for it? Right? So then your next logical step would be to compare the athlete's current abilities to meet those demands with the demands that are going to be imposed upon them. So basically what that means to me is I have my point A would be, where's the athlete at this point in time? Probably deficient in meeting some of those demands. Point B is your desired state of affairs. So basically where the athlete is able to meet all of these demands. And now I basically have a more accurate GPS tracking or a device that's going to lead me from A to B. While if I don't know what B is, if I don't know the desired affair or state of affairs, if I don't know where A is, where the current state of affairs is, it's going to be very difficult for me to develop a plan that's going to be efficient and effective at improving sport performance. Because at the end of it, we have all these specialists generally, especially if you work at bigger organizations, and this, the bigger the organization, the more specialists you have, the more people you have within the same organization that overvalue what they bring to the table, right? Physical prep coach is going to say, oh, the physical aspect is most important. Your sport coaches, basketball trainers are going to say, no, the technical or the tactical. Your mental coach might say the psychological aspect is most important. So this helps us to understand by appreciating the demands or the desired affairs or state of affairs and appreciate that combined with where the athlete currently is to then be able to determine, okay, where does our attention need to go? Does our attention need to be placed more on the physical demands, the technical, the tactical, psychological, or maybe as an addition into the cultural aspects of things or different variables? So if we are able to analyze this process, then we're probably able to deliver more efficient and effective training interventions, whether it is any of these different factors that we're aiming to improve. And that's where I believe understanding as a coach, regardless of your background, what the athlete needs to work on or what the team needs to work on, and taking yourself out of that picture, saying, okay, I need to look at this as objectively as possible in making sure that my athletes go from A to B as efficiently and effectively as possible, instead of saying, all right, I'm just a physical guy and I'm just going to get them stronger, faster, jump higher, etc., without understanding, okay, but how is that going to work in the bigger picture? Is that going to improve sport performance? Because that, in the end, should be your bottom line. There should be no alternative. Your only job, if you work in elite level sports, is to improve sport performance. Sometimes that means we need to place far more emphasis on physical development. Sometimes that means we need to place far more emphasis on technical or tactical development. Whatever it might be, it has to serve its purpose in improving sport performance. In order to do that, we need to understand what the demands are and where the athlete currently is.
Gotcha. And that makes a ton of sense. So going into understanding those demands, addressing those needs are usually going to be done in the off season. How have you in the past, working with the Dutch men's national team, gone about evaluating what those needs are and then how it fits in with the technical aspect of their training?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I totally agree. If you're going to be improving a lot of these capacities or qualities or factors, um, you're most likely going to get most of your bang out of your buck if you're doing this in an off-season setting. In season, there's far more complexity to this process because of the amount of stress that players or the entire team is exposed to them is immense during the season, and that's something that's often disregarded or not taken into appropriate consideration. So I definitely agree that your off season is the most important time of the year for that. Um, for me, again, it comes down to, first of all, having an overall perspective of what do we need to work on or what are we most likely going to need to work on. And then from there is, okay, what am I preparing for? I am generally going to have to prepare an athlete for the preseason because the preseason is going to prepare them for the actual in-season phase. So that's the first thing, because let's say you're working with athletes and your sport coach, your head basketball coach, he has a tendency to run them into the ground, twice a day from the onset of preseason. That means that you either need to convince your head coach to utilize a different approach throughout the preseason, or you need to prepare your athletes for those demands because you're not able to influence him or her. So, in one sense, you can say, all right, we're preparing for preseason or we're preparing for the start of the actual season itself. But either way, again, we're reverse engineering demands. I am preparing for what the athletes are going to be exposed to in the future. Now, I also have a time span, right? My offseason could be 8 weeks, could be 12 weeks, could be 16 weeks, whatever it might be. Let's say it's 12 weeks. Now, I know what's going to be asked of them in 12 weeks, or hopefully I get as close to that as possible. And then I say, all right, I also have this amount of time. Then from there, I want to know, okay, but I know where B is. I actually know kind of how much time I have to spend on this road to B, but what's point A? And for point A, you probably need to have some kind of assessment set up. Now, those assessments can be variable throughout the off season, right? They can have different assessments throughout the off season because maybe at the onset you're not ready to implement certain assessments with them because they might not be fit for those assessments or they might not be appropriate for that point in time. But you want to assess where the athlete is. So whether that's from a technical, tactical, mental, or physical aspect or perspective, that doesn't really matter, but we do want to have assessments. Now, we could gather data for the sake of gathering data, obviously, right. But the most important thing here is to utilize, your assessments that are either prescriptive in nature, meaning they prescribe what kind of training interventions are likely going to be most efficient or effective, or they need to be descriptive and show an accurate picture of where the athlete currently is. If your assessment doesn't do one of those two things or both very well, then it probably isn't worth your time.
Could you provide maybe like an example of one of each?
So, for instance, a counter movement vertical jump would be an assessment that accurately describes your ability to perform or produce force vertically within the time constraints that is relevant for the sport, right? For the sporting actions in general. While, for instance, a 1 rep max squat or a 3-rep max, 5-rep max, depending on what kind of tool you utilize. Maybe an isometric mid thigh pull could also prescribe training loads for the following training cycle. So those two assessments, which obviously have been implemented throughout decades of training interventions and assessments, they're probably going to be worth your while. While maybe some assessments don't either influence your training process or tell you anything that's worthwhile to take the time to test for. Because even if you're in the off-season phase, yes, you might have more time. Yes, you might have more adaptive energy available to you. Doesn't mean you should waste it, right? So I should still prioritize those assessments that are descriptive or prescriptive in nature. From a physical perspective, again, now if I start the off season, I'm probably not going to do a 5RM squat because that's probably not the time to test it. There might be different ways to gather that data. For instance, there are plenty of formulas available that allow you to guesstimate a 1-rep max value based on the volume and the intensity that you're able to utilize within training, and over time, thus monitoring how the 1-rep max or the maximal output moves along that off-season phase, basically. So those are different ways to attack this. But it just comes down to having the appropriate assessment that is prescriptive or descriptive at that point in time. So again, starting off, I'm assessing, I'm making sure that I know where the athlete is. I have the time span that's available to me, and then I know where I want to be, which is point B, which is preparing them for the demands of either preseason or the in-season phase. Now, from there, it comes down to, okay, I've made this assessment. And probably the sport coach, the basketball coach, whether it's assistant or the skill trainer or the head coach, has also seen things. Now, of course, quantifying some of those capacities from a technical or tactical perspective can be far more difficult than the physical perspective. So we shouldn't underestimate the value of of the skills coach or the basketball coach's eye, basically, their ability to analyze movement or analyze what the athlete should improve upon without having anything truly, quote unquote, quantifiable. But we need to put that side to side. All right, because let's say I have an athlete that jumps, let's say 20 inches, right? And you've over time gathered the data that athletic populations are at the same competitive level as this athlete on average, jump 22 inches with a standard deviation of, let's say, 4 inches. So this athlete is within one standard deviation of the mean. Does that imply that this athlete must spend time on this physical capacity? Potentially, but probably not, right? It, of course, depends. How far along the curve are they? Are they very experienced? Have they spent a lot of time towards this? What is the likelihood that we're going to be able to squeeze a little bit more out of this? Is it going to cost us a lot of adaptive energy and time, or is it going to be very easy? If it's a beginner, that's 2 inches below the mean, then, by all means, let's just attack it with a minimal dose, see what happens. Now, let's say we have an athlete that's already been playing professionally for 10 years with success, and they're 2 inches below the mean. Is improving that going to really change the baseline of saying, all right, we're trying to improve sport performance? Probably not. So then is that going to be our biggest point of attention? Also unlikely. But what if that athlete is at 16 inches and the average or the mean of the data that you've gathered is 24 with a standard deviation of 2? Now, this athlete is very far below the mean. He's very far below where you would want to be at that level. So it could be of hindrance for that athlete to be able to perform at the level at which he or she is vying to compete at.
I hope he has a nice floater.
Yeah, exactly. You need a very good floater in order to finish over everyone. But at that point, it becomes more likely that you're going to spend time towards improving that physical capacity. While if you have an athlete with the same population, but he might jump 35, you're not going to spend any time developing that. It's probably already at that level. If you're talking about Zion Williamson, there's really no point in making that guy jump higher. There are other things that are more worthy of addressing than the pure physical capacity of the ability to jump higher vertically, right? So it comes down to understanding not only where the athlete is in general, but also when comparing them to the athletic population that he or she is at this point competing in or vying to compete in, right? If you're going from college to the NBA, that changes. The speed that they are able to operate at from a physical perspective is higher. They're more explosive, they're stronger, et cetera, et cetera. So if I'm saying I'm trying to prepare someone for the next level, then I need to compare it to that, obviously. But going back to that point, because that was a little side rant, going back to the point of saying, all right, I need to compare this, so the physical perspective data, with the technical or tactical perspectives or the mental perspectives, and then say, what is the most pressing issue to address? Where do we need to spend our adaptive energy and our time if we want to develop this athlete to the point where they're able to perform the sport at a higher level? And that's where, in my opinion, again, understanding that your role is only as one little aspect or one part of the big machine, basically, and understanding that there are other people that might have more value at this point in time with this given athlete. Now, for instance, with the 3-on-3 Dutch men's national basketball team, for me, the skills trainer is the art from all-day athletes, who's brilliant in understanding movement, improving technical qualities, etc. So if we had a longer phase of training, me and him would sit down and discuss what players would likely need. Now, we were working with a relatively older population, more experienced players, 30 to 35 years old. That means you cannot take them out of that process. If anyone's worked with established athletes, you have to involve them in that process. Of course, that's generally speaking, because otherwise you're not going to get the buy-in. You're not going to get the motivation from them to actually sit through the entire process and make sure that you're actually putting in the work, right? Or that they're actually putting in the work. So it would be a discussion between the athlete, the skills trainer, or the sport coach, and in this case, the strength and conditioning coach, to determine, okay, what are we going to need to work on? For some athletes, that might mean more time in the weight room. For others, that might mean more time working on skills in one-on-one or small group sessions. It depends on the athlete, and it's the most important thing, and I actually already said it, but I'll say it again, is to kind of take away as a coach your own ego and view it more objectively, basically stepping away from the scenario or the situation you're in and saying, okay, what is truly the most important aspect for this player to develop if they want to improve sport performance at the level at which they're vying to compete at?
That's a very interesting point. And you talked about how at the beginning of the offseason, you're constantly assessing to know our current status, so we know where to go based on the time available and the tools available to us. In regard, I know you're not part of the technical side, but since you've been so close to Yard with that, what were some maybe KPIs or ways that you guys measured whether improvements were being made on the technical side?
Well, like you said, for one, I'm definitely not I'm very interested in the technical and tactical aspects of basketball, but I'm not fooling myself. I am by no means a skills trainer or a basketball coach. I do believe, as a little side note, that if you want to succeed working in a sport as a strength coach or maybe as a skills coach, et cetera, to have a passion for the other fields or the other specialists within that same realm. So maybe for me, that would be my interest in technical development. Maybe for a technical coach, that would be more interested in the physical aspect of it, because it allows or it increases your ability to have meaningful conversations that might be able to then, as a team, move the needle more efficiently and effectively for the players you're working with or the team you're working with. Because, for instance, if a skills trainer understands physical demands better, then that's going to enhance your abilities to program or design a training intervention far greater than if you don't know the impact of standing on your feet for 2 hours a day, or what high acceleration load might do for you, or what a lot of change of direction might do for you, or if the basketball coach is spending a lot of time jumping or doing a lot of finishing drills off one foot at higher speeds while the strength coach is doing plyos in the morning, how that might interfere with each other and how that actually while if you look at them separately, they might be good training interventions, but if you look at it holistically from the macro perspective, how that might actually be detrimental to performance. So I believe having that natural, interest or curiosity towards each different fields, and then allowing that to enhance your ability to have meaningful conversations, so you as a staff, as a team, can have increase your ability to move the needle in the right direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's been a huge challenge for me because, as you know, I handle the technical side, tactical side, as well as the physical side for Jeremy. But I think one thing I've recognized over the years too is the importance of, I am not a professional in the psychological aspect. So, having a mental coach or having somebody, a therapist or someone who can work with him on that front is of such value. And then from the physical standpoint, there's many other coaches who have been in the trenches and have done this way longer than I have that I need to be learning from. So I think, when working on more of the private side with a single athlete, for me, it's been, okay, how can I identify specialists in each of those areas and get the support I need? Because you could spend a lifetime in each one of those coactives, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, that's the biggest pitfall, in my opinion, is, you start to read into some of these different fields, or you start to speak to people in those fields, and you're at this onset of your Dunning-Kruger life, and you're basically thinking like, oh, I got all the knowledge now and I'm able to implement this. And that would be your pitfall, is understanding that there are far more intricacies to whatever someone does. So for me, going back to saying, all right, I work with the art and he's doing all the technical, tactical work. For me, a lot of it would be to analyze his sessions. Just sit there, and he was actually nice enough to oftentimes use me as a stunt dummy, especially in post-up scenarios. Sometimes fun, sometimes horrifying. But it would allow me to kind of analyze and observe what he was doing over time and see how his drills would develop. Because, I mean, you understand this as well. Like, there are certain principles that are bigger than me as a strength coach or you as a skills coach. They apply to every setting, right? Whether I might induce progressive overload in the form of intensity or volume in the weight room, we also see a progressive overload from a coordinative perspective or a complexity aspect on the court, right? All these different things, they basically apply regardless of setting. And so over time, I'm able to see what he does and how he starts to layer his session. So within the sessions, how he starts to do things, because I'm starting to pick out little bits and pieces of information as to how he layers his workouts, and then also how he layers it over time. So how over time the complexity for some individual athletes might increase while he keeps it relatively simple for others, because one might need that complexity to enhance their game, while the other just needs to be able to do 2 or 3 things very well, and they're probably not going to be able to expand, your quote unquote bag that much. So being able to observe and analyze his work and then ask him questions, or say like, all right, I think this might be, such and such. And then he'll just look at me and laugh. And then he'll, for instance, say like, oh, you'll see. And then he'll put me in the session and then feels terrible. And I'm like, all right, I get it now. No. So having those conversations, asking him questions, that again enhances my curiosity towards that whole process or that whole field of sport performance. And now I learn more about that craft. And I learn that there are so many details about it that I need to appreciate, instead of me saying, all right, I know everything about this, because there's so many layers to it. Whenever he makes a decision, whenever he uses a certain drill, it's for a reason. Well, I might say like, oh, okay, well, yeah, there's that little drill that he's using, and I can implement that too. And I think, again, that going back to that point, that's the pitfall of saying, all right, I'm learning from these new fields. I see something and now I'm able to implement it. Basically, your quote unquote monkey see, monkey do kind of scenario. Yeah. So although we need to appreciate that, and I feel like we need to involve ourselves in those fields to have a base level of knowledge in order to have these meaningful conversations, we do have to appreciate that, yes, it takes a lifetime to develop your knowledge base to be able to excel at that level. Within that specialty, we need to appreciate that and understand that our knowledge base of that probably won't be able to equal that.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of watching some exercises on Instagram and then implementing them right away. Or for me, going to one of Jeremy's strength and conditioning sessions with an NBA team, one workout and being like, okay, let's implement those. I know what he's doing, right? There's just so much nuance and detail, and it depends. It depends on so many other details when making these decisions.
And that's, while I appreciate social media for all it is, that is one of the harder parts about it. It's so difficult to deliver that kind of nuance. It is so difficult to say, well, I am doing this for all these reasons, which are layered upon a ton of other reasons, layered upon a ton of other reasons. After a while, you start to make, or you implement things which, in my opinion, look very simple on the outside, but what they're based upon might be very intricate and might be very detailed.
Yeah.
But if you just look at it from a global perspective, you might like, oh, I can do that. Like, I can implement that. Yes, but I might be doing this for a totally different reason than what you're seeing here. And it's just, you're unable to deliver that kind of message through social media because it's supposed to just grab your attention, like it, shared, whatever, and then move on. And that's basically not what high performance or elite sport is all about. It is about understanding all these details and then putting it into work and making something very difficult look very simple.
Well, you still seem to do very well with the algo gods, so all respect to you. No, I totally get what you're saying. And I was listening to, I think his name's Carl Bergenstorm. He's the director of performance for the Golden State Warriors, and he's from Canada. And someone asked him, when you came in and you were working with a KD, Steph, Clay, how did you get buy-in, or how did you get them to buy into your program, or how did you start implementing change? And his answer was, do less. At the onset, it's about not messing up, in the sense that you want to come in and you want to say like, okay, I'm here now. I got to prove my chops. I'm going to make all of these changes. I'm going to start making people do all these things. But in reality, he was like, you have to understand what they're doing, what's realistic, and first start with observation and then do less, get buy-in, and then slowly build it up. But, in regards to social media, how are you going to communicate the concept of do less, or be more simple, or maybe less assessments or less fancy stuff? Actually, let me regress. Regression is probably not a super popular concept on social media and hard to communicate, right? But he would not be communicating like all these advanced things he was doing, but just kind of the regressions, or his thought process of reducing things to its basic principles and understanding, distilling that, and then building it up.
That Carl says that makes a lot of sense to me, and I view it similarly. If it kind of goes back to that point of me and saying, all right, you want to step out of your own position and kind of observe more objectively what your own value is within a certain scenario. And you're talking about guys like Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, you're not gonna, if you think that your work is going to make a massive difference in moving the needle in the right direction for an athlete that is already so damn good at their sport, you're probably not looking in the mirror enough. You're probably not critically analyzing your own added value, because those athletes have been able to perform at the highest level in the sport. They're all-time athletes, all-time performers without you. They didn't need you to get there. Now, you might be able to help them long-term with a very small margin. You might be able to, if you do everything right, or you get close to doing everything right, yes, you might be able to help them. But the odds that you are going to do something that could harm them is likely greater than you helping them, because they're already so damn good at their sport. So at this point, if I were to be him, I'd use the same cautious approach of saying, I'd rather do very little, do that very well, observe, analyze, and over time, as I learn more about the athlete, maybe I start to sprinkle in a little bit more of my philosophy of the things that I prioritize, the things that I believe to be as close to the quote unquote truth as possible. But that only happens over time. Because let's say I am right and I might be able to enhance them by 0.5% versus I am wrong and I can take away 25%. Now, this is, of course, just random numbers. But the downsides, the cost of that is far greater than the potential upside. So I love his approach in that sense in saying, all right, you're working with athletes that are this good and there is no urgency for you to change anything, then it's probably best to step back. Now, if you're working with someone that has very high urgency and something is definitely lacking, that's easily observable and it needs to happen very quickly, then maybe, yes, you intervene faster and with more urgency. But in scenarios such as Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Kevin Durant, Draymond Green, they're all-time greats without me. And they will be all-time greats without me for the rest of their career too. Yeah. So I totally agree with his observations on how he's probably handled that, even though, I wasn't there, obviously.
Yeah, and I've thought about this with Jeremy as well, in the sense that, when Jeremy goes to see a specialist, they might say, oh, he has all of these dysfunctions. But because he drives right and goes downhill and he plays a certain style, he's going to have some asymmetries, right? And it's understanding which asymmetries are we okay with, right? Because like we said, if we just go and randomly, based on textbook or numbers, just start to arbitrarily attack an asymmetry just because it's an asymmetry, it might affect the technical skill. And at that point, is it worth it, right? And I don't know what the balance is, but I have been thinking about that more and more as maybe we've seen more specialists over time and they've told us like all of these things have to change, yada yada yada. But then I'm kind of thinking too, like, okay, we made those changes, but he's slower. Okay, like, is that the right solution? Well, now if you can't get to the basket, well, now we're not even who we are, then is it worth it, right? So those are kind of things that, I've gone back and forth in my mind as well.
That's a very valid point, and I also agree that those are questions you start to ask yourself more and more over time. I do believe that oftentimes as a field within sport performance in general, that we think we have the answers, and that we want everyone to move in this universally agreed upon manner. While I do believe the last couple of years, and I might be wrong, it has shifted a little bit more towards the appreciation of differences in movement strategies between sports, but also, for instance, between sides within one athlete. And now we're not always trying to say like, oh, we need minimal asymmetry in whatever movement we're talking about. So I do believe we're starting to shift a little bit more over towards that side, because our ability to analyze which movement patterns are quote unquote dangerous, I believe is grossly overestimated. Like our ability to analyze this, our ability to say this is dangerous or this is not. In my opinion, certain movement strategies will put more stress on a given structure than others, right? So moving your spine in one way might induce less load or more load, so less strain or more strain on a given structure within the spine. That does not, by definition, make that movement inherently dangerous. It comes down to what is the athlete able to handle from a demand perspective, globally as well as locally within that structure itself, and what is the imposed stress. So if the athlete is able to handle a certain level of stress, and that is the same stress that is then asked of the athlete of globally or within that structure itself, then nothing's wrong. But if the athlete is unable to handle a certain level of stress, that the athlete is going to be exposed to, then that might cause trouble and it might increase the risk of injury by I don't know how many fold, right?
Yeah.
So does that mean for me that a certain movement is going to be dangerous? No. We just need to understand what is the athlete capable of handling from a stress perspective globally as well as locally within certain structures, and what is the athlete going to be exposed to? And it comes back to your reverse engineering process, right? Now, let's say I have an athlete that is currently unable to practice for 45 minutes before he or she is exposed to Achilles tendon pain. Mm-hmm. And eventually, in 3 months' time, you're going to need that athlete to be able to do 2-a-days with their team. If you don't do anything to increase that work capacity, that capacity of the athlete to handle the stress that's imposed upon them by the point that they're going to be in 3 months' time, the likelihood that they're going to get injured when they are exposed to those 2 sessions a day is going to be super high. That doesn't mean that the motion itself that puts the stress on that Achilles is inherently dangerous. Now, right. Of course, does this mean that we do not need to spend time improving the ability to move, improving kinematics of movements? No, absolutely. Of course you want to. But in my opinion, largely from the perspective of movement efficiency, increasing outputs, increasing the ability to move well so that we're able to move faster or able to, whatever aspect might be of importance to performance. So, of course, we look at it from a health, we look at it from a performance standpoint, and we address these kinematics, but we shouldn't overestimate or overstate how good we are at truly analyzing that from a health perspective. I feel like from a performance or movement efficiency standpoint, we're getting a lot better. Although even in, let's say, basketball, from a technical perspective, you see a lot of athletes with very, very, very different styles of shooting, for instance, be very successful. There are certain commonalities between all of them, but there's a lot of fluctuation around that, right? So if there are so many different ways to achieve the same goal, we need to appreciate that maybe we don't know exactly or as much as we think we know. And then from a health perspective, I feel like that's even more the case, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And an example to me for shooting that you just brought up is there's quite a bit, especially if you watch James Harden, quite a bit of knee valgus when he goes down. And it's kind of one of those things where actually amongst a lot of elite shooters, you see that. But then, you see maybe a Steve Nash or some of these other players who don't have it. And you begin to wonder like, oh, is that detrimental? But also that might be a optimal movement strategy for him with pronation, and it might be very efficient for him. And he probably has shot 100,000 shots that way already. Like if he was going to get injured, he probably would have gotten injured already shooting that way. Right.
And I think as you bring that up, we've spoken about this before. Let's say you're talking about someone, how old is James now? Roughly?
Like 30, 32, I think.
Now let's say he's 32 and he's been shooting in this manner for, let's say, at least the past 15 years, and you were to alter this significantly, right? You were making a big difference in how his lower body moves within a given shot, and then you let him shoot again. Let's say arbitrarily he shoots 700 shots a day. You might actually enhance or increase the risk of injury, because although he might have less strain on one structure by moving that way, he's not accustomed to moving that way. And there is a likelihood that his body is thus not able to handle those stressors. So changing something because you perceive it to be more risky could actually have higher, exactly, quote unquote, more risky, can actually have more downsides than potential. Now, again, if something is off from a movement efficiency perspective, and that's why they're not able to perform, then by all means, you probably will need to tinker with that. Again, the more advanced an athlete or the further along the road, it's going to be harder to adjust that because their skills have already been ingrained for so long. It's going to be more difficult, and it's going to make more time making you question whether it is the right path to try to change it, but there's more reason for it. But I just wouldn't overstate, or I wouldn't overestimate our own ability to analyze movement from a health perspective. And it actually makes me think, there was this, I saw this post and it was a while ago. And I actually believe I was talking about it with Yard, and it was someone giving prescriptions for minimizing or mitigating risk of ACL tears. Mm. And what this post prescribed on Instagram was to, when you're changing direction, to position the outside foot closer to the center of mass.
Mm-hmm. More under there.
Which would then reduce the risk of injury because it places less strain on the knee. Going back to what you said, now if I want to change direction, I probably need at high speeds and get out of it at high speeds, I probably need to position my foot relatively far, or plant my foot relatively far outside of my center of mass. Mm-hmm. So if you prescribe me to plant it closer, what's going to happen? Yes, I have less stress, but in return, I start to suck at sport. Now, there is an inherent risk of playing sport. That's just the way it is. If you don't want to get hurt, you probably shouldn't be doing elite sport. So, of course, we want to mitigate risk, but we also want to optimize performance. So when I see stuff like that, it's like, I don't know if sharing that kind of information is going to do the field any good, because we're not paying attention to what truly matters, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's indicative of where our society is today, which is we want prescriptive answers. It's much more easier. It's a lot easier to say, just place your foot under your hip and that will reduce, just don't have any knee valgus and then you'll be okay, right? That to me, for general population, is a lot more consumable than saying, here's this highly nuanced situation and these circumstances, and please factor in the technical, tactical, and physical aspects of this movement.
Well, and then, I mean, if you address the knee valgus discussion, right? Like, where does it primarily come from? From the weightlifting or the lifting community, as in squatting specifically, and potential increased demand on the knee joint in those situations. And then from there, what basically starts to develop is this overall notion that knee valgus is bad. But then we look at basketball players, we look at athletes in general, and a lot of the situations, it's not even knee valgus, although the knees might be turned in, or it might be knee valgus, but it is in situations where it is truly appropriate or actually beneficial towards outputs within those sporting actions.
And loaded, not excessively loaded.
Exactly. So for instance, whether you are experiencing a position or whether you're strategizing yourself into a position of knee valgus is very different if you're doing it during the takeoff of a jump shot versus maybe a single leg landing off a breakaway dunk. Those are two very different situations in which it might occur. But also, to me, if you're never exposing yourself to knee valgus situations,
what's going to happen
at one point in time, you are going to be exposed to that movement in sport because you can't control your movement. That's just how it's going to be. You're going to be exposed to situations. And if you are not prepared for that, if you have not developed the structures to be able to handle those stressors, what's going to happen?
Injury, potentially.
Right. Or at least a far increased risk of injury. So I believe it is better to develop robustness than it is to run away from these high stress situations or these high, more risky endeavors, basically. With that being said, obviously, you don't do that at the onset of the offseason because your athletes are fatigued from the season and they're probably not prepared for it. So you want to gradually overload them to that point, but you don't want to negate it. It's important because it prepares for the demands of sport, which again goes back to your reverse engineering perspective.
So we've been experiencing some technical difficulties because I'm in Palo Alto and apparently in Silicon Valley, the internet is not very good. So apologies to Yoeri for some of the technical difficulties, but trying to finish and wrap this up, what's something you have changed your mind on in the past year or two? So maybe something that you've always done in the past where you're like, probably not going to use this as much anymore.
So you sent me this question, right? I like start to think about it and start to think about it some more, and I'm like, I really don't have anything. Like it's ridiculous. Um, like I don't have any concrete examples of things that I was doing where I'm like, oh, I'm really doing that completely differently now.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the biggest difference is that over time, over the past few years, I've started to sharpen what my principles are and how I apply them.
Mm.
So I've had core principles since the beginning, and they kind of develop and they don't remain stagnant. Basically, they develop because you're young and you're young in the field also. So like you don't know your true north yet, right? But you have certain principles, and over time they kind of develop. And over the past few years, I feel like they've become pretty robust to different situations that I've worked in. I've seen I've encountered different problems, different situations, and they've remained pretty robust throughout it all.
Mm-hmm.
But how I'm able to implement that within different contexts, within different situations, I've been able to do that a lot better.
Mm.
So for me in the beginning, like you start to develop certain principles, you're like, yes, this is a principle, okay, but how does that work in practice? And how does that principle lead to action? And I feel like now over these past few years, I'm starting to not really, evolve the principles as much anymore, but now it's the evolution of the subsequent action that comes from those principles. So it's not something in particular where I'm saying like, oh, well, I used to do so many plyos and now I stopped doing it, or I used to only train short range of motion, now I train only large range of motion. It is more how to make action or create action out of these core principles, with one obviously being, for instance, the basic one or the base one, the foundational one is the ability to improve sport performance. Or another principle might be the preparation for the demands of sport. So the reverse engineering process, those might be principles, but then how does that work in practice? Mm-hmm. And over the past few years is what happened, or what's happened for me is that has become a little bit more clear and also repeatable in different situations. Like, okay, this works really well regardless of the situation that I've been in. So it is likely of value, of my best interest, to utilize that again in the future. And then from there, review, critically analyze, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sorry, I can't give you anything better than that, because that's basically the thing that's changed for me. But I also feel like that's very valuable, because it is a way for me, or this process has been a way for me to navigate through all the uncertainties of working in pro sport and working with a complex system that is the human body.
That is the authentic answer, which is the most important answer. I think maybe a small follow-up question, because I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, because I think it could be its own podcast, is can you share maybe one or two more of those general principles that help guide you in your decision-making? And just to also really quickly respond to what you were saying was, I think what you're saying is you're seeing the manifestation of those principles in action, and it's currently giving you positive feedback as to, yes, those principles still stand true. And you're seeing different circumstances like happen, and basically that's reinforcing those principles, but then also allows you to maybe apply them more broadly to other circumstances. So that's my response. And then my question to you is, can you share a couple more of those general principles that guide you?
Yeah. So like I said, foundationally, it starts at ensuring that I'm improving, or that I'm optimizing the odds of increasing sport performance. Then it comes to reverse engineering. Then for me, another one, or a very important one, is, what you could consider the best ability is availability principle, or the mitigating risk given the improvement of sport performance. So in order to improve sport performance, your athletes need to play the sport frequently and at preferably a high level. In order to do this, They need to practice a sport, and so they can't be hurt. So one of those principles then is, although I am aiming to improve sport performance, I need to understand that the health aspect of that is massively important. So that might lead you to utilize different training interventions throughout the season than you might use throughout the off season. Because we're in one scenario, we already are exposed to high levels of stress through competition, through sport practice, through travel, through media, and all the other things that an athlete might be exposed to on the side, from your sponsorships to your contractual obligations, to your family, to friends, all those different stressors. That might mean, in order to mitigate risk and optimize their ability to play the sport, we need a different training intervention than in a scenario where we're not traveling as much, where we don't have sport practice, where we don't have games, i.e. the off season. So those might be two different training interventions based on the perspective of, I want to optimize the odds of health, which then optimize the odds of performance. Another core principle for me is to compare or contrast long versus short-term benefits or considerations. So when I look at an intervention, or when I look at anything I might do with my athletes, I need to consider, how is that going to benefit, or how is that going to elicit a response short-term, and what is it going to elicit for a response long-term? So the effect short-term might be enhanced performance. Long-term, it might have negative consequences. Could be vice versa. So those are another aspect where I'm saying, okay, let's say we're on a game day -2, so we're 2 days in front of a game. I can say, all right, long-term, these squats, these 3x5 at 85% might do a lot for increasing their strength levels. This athlete is far below the mean for the athletic population at which he or she operates at, So we need to put in these squats because it's going to help the athlete be able to compete at a higher level in the future. That could be your long-term perspective. Short-term, however, you understand this. Game day -2, 2 days before, 48 hours before a game, we're doing 3x5 squats at 85%. Well, that's probably not going to elicit very good short-term responses, and it might get you fired. So from that perspective, you're weighing those two scenarios. Okay, what's more important, the short-term or the long-term? Also, from the perspective, let's say we have athletes that are playing much or aren't playing much, then that might change. Are we perceiving long-term as more important, or are we perceiving short-term as more important? Someone that might be the 12th guy on your roster, the one that's on the edge of the bench that doesn't play at all, versus you going back to Carl's scenario, you're working with Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. You're probably not having the same emphasis on short-term versus long-term responses because they're in different scenarios. So those are two core principles for me that lead some of this decision making, that if I'm addressing a situation or a context that I'm in, that I can revert back to those principles and say, all right, my principle is the optimization of health to optimize performance, or the principle of long-term versus short-term. And you can already see how these principles intertwine. They're not separate things, but writing them down, or at least having them in your head what they are, allows you to have more of an internal GPS for decision making. And then, like I said, what has developed more now over these past few years for me is how that leads to action. So how these principles actually lay the foundation for actions or interventions within my job, within my realm of influence, if that makes sense.
And I think one underlying principle amongst all the ones that you just shared are, is it effective and is it efficient, right? Because everything we just talked about is it effective? Did we get what we wanted to get done? And then efficient, did we do it maybe with the least energy expenditure, and did we do it in the most quick, optimized manner, right? And I think almost all of those things can be distilled to that, right? Like those are the two questions I think that I got from you that I think are very helpful in thinking critically about our sessions. Is, was it effective? Did we take one step closer to the goal, or we've been using GPS a lot, right? Like, did we take one more step closer to like our destination? And did we detour, or did we kind of take, you know, the most optimal path based on your principles? That is ultimately shows like that you're a very critical thinker. I guess, you know, ending this episode with a lot of, with so much that you've seen, Strength Coach Network, in your network, different podcasts, what advice would you give to maybe your younger self or a younger aspiring coach, other than to ask better questions, which I think is a very important piece of advice? But do you have, the veteran Yoeri, do you have any other pieces of advice?
I don't know if being younger than 30 qualifies as veteran status.
It does in my book. We're talking about professional sports.
All right. Yeah, true. No, like you said, I do believe that the ability to ask better questions is integral towards development as a coach. You know, if I go back and I look at how I was in the beginning, I would draw conclusions pretty quickly. Like, I would think I had answers when I should have looked for more questions, or I should have asked more questions to myself. Like, I would get into a scenario, and if my first year in strength and conditioning, if I would have gotten Carl's job with the Warriors, I would have thought that I had the answers to make Kevin Durant better and Steph Curry better. I would have been like, well, Kevin Durant has a physical deficiency because he can't bench 185 at the combine. If you can't bench 185, then you can't play basketball. Like, you're weak. I mean, yes, maybe Kevin Durant could potentially benefit from increased physical capacity from the perspective of strength relative to body weight or overall strength outputs. Yeah, maybe that could help him. Is the time and the energy you are going to put into that project going to outweigh his time that he would otherwise spend on the court developing technical, tactical, or other physical qualities? I don't know, but that's a question. You're asking yourself another question. Well, it would have been for me, Kevin Durant can't bench 185. Kevin Durant needs to bench more because Kevin Durant's weak. Now I might ask myself, if I make him stronger, upper body, full body, whatever, if I make him stronger relative to his peers, is that going to enhance his ability to perform the sport? That's one question. Then another question might be, well, if that's the case, how is that going to weigh against the alternative? What's the cost of opportunity? What could I have done with that same adaptive energy and time that I now spend in the weight room developing this level of strength? Or would it be more beneficial to develop strength within the context of the sport, aka practicing contact situations? Who knows? I don't have the answer. I don't know him personally. I don't know the situation. But when I was younger, I would have been very adamant that I have the answers and that I knew it. While now I would be far closer to saying, all right, you have a scenario, you don't have all the knowledge, you don't have all the answers for that scenario that you're in, for that context, you never do, but you can get closer. You can get closer to what you might consider the, as I said earlier, the quote unquote truth, right? Try to get there as close as possible. And then from there, make a best case scenario given all the information that you do have. You don't have more than that. But at that point, you want to decide based on the best information you have available to you. I've been in situations where afterwards I might have thought, ooh, I should have done this differently. But I made the decision based on the information that I gathered at that time, and I didn't know any better. So I can't look back and say that was a mistake. I could have done, like now, retrospectively, yes, I would have done it differently, but I didn't know that at that point in time. As long as you aim to gather the knowledge that you have available to you, and then you decide based on all that knowledge, instead of the little bit of knowledge that you already have and you think that that is everything, and you don't think there's anything more, if you start doing that, then you're probably on the right path. So ask those questions to yourself. Don't just stop at one piece of information. Try to keep digging. And eventually you're going to get to a point of information where you're like, yeah, this is friggin' useless. Okay, we can discard this or we can discard that. But that process of asking questions, critically analyzing your own abilities, critically analyzing your own biases, because for one, every bit of information that I process, whenever we speak, everything you say goes through my filter of all my previous experiences, of all my biases, of all the heuristics that I have, meaning it is not absolute truth. By definition, it is impossible to be absolute truth. I don't know the absolute truth. So there is a chance, relatively large chance even, that I'm wrong. Now, as I start to develop certain principles that might have been tested by time, certain principles maybe as physics principles, those might apply relatively universally or globally. Those I can rely upon, right? While other principles might fluctuate a little bit more, but at least once I start basing my decisions on those principles that have developed from years of asking questions, trying to find more information, then I'm likely going to be closer to understanding the quote unquote truth and making the best possible interventions or decisions for the populations that I work with. And if, again, my core principle is to improve sport performance, enhancing my athlete's ability to do so, then that is what I have to do in order to get there. That is my duty basically as a coach, because that's what you sign up for.
I would add, if I may, add one piece of advice that I have gotten from listening to your previous podcast too, is the importance of creating a network around you that so for instance, you have Eddie who took your former position on 3-on-3, and you have Yard, and you have other people that you've reached out to that constantly can challenge your methodology and your way of thinking, constantly can poke holes in your way of thinking, and vice versa, that continue to help. You guys are iron sharpening iron, basically. I think that is, why I've been so attracted to having conversations with you, because every time I talk, I feel like a freaking dull butter knife, and realize that there's a lot of areas that I still need to sharpen even. And I don't know, it's this concept of, it really is, I'm not just saying this, like the concept that as I learn more, as I talk to more people who critically think all the time, I just constantly feel like I don't know anything. Not that I don't know anything, but that there's still so many levels to this. And every time I think I get to another level, I meet someone who's I feel like a kindergartner again.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. Like I said, every piece of information you filter through with your own biases, your own previous experiences, etc. By surrounding yourself with like-minded individuals that might have a different perspective, or they view how you act and what you do from a different perspective, that then allows you, if of course you take their advice and the discussions you have with them, if you take that and you consider that they might be right, or that they might have more of an objective perspective of how you operate than even you do, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at all these different perspectives from the people around you, then that can be massively influential. The only problem is, I believe a lot of people are comfortable, mm-hmm. and a lot of people surround themselves with people that think the same or say yes to everything that you might have to say, which again is, for instance, where social media might be a downfall for a lot of people, because the following you generate are people that oftentimes like you, oftentimes look up to you. And so they're always going to confirm whatever you might say, while being around people that are critical, being around people that look at you a little bit more objectively helps you grow, because it allows you to see yourself without all these biases, without all these preconceived notions and these heuristics that you use to come to decisions or decision making. So yeah, I believe that's super important. I can't understate and how grateful I am for having people close to me that have that kind of critical thinking, as well as further away from me that I can rely on for certain conversations. Because especially as you get further into the field, it becomes harder and harder and harder to get the information that you need from textbooks or papers, journals, podcasts, etc. Because the problems that you encounter are very detailed and specific for a given context. And oftentimes you need to talk to someone else that might have been in a very similar context, that might have had those experiences before, and might have already asked the questions that you're currently asking yourself. So I agree wholeheartedly on this. I feel like that's super important and I'm very grateful for it. And unfortunately, most of the more critical thinkers I know have this sense of insecurity, which is often why they don't publicly share a lot of things, because they believe that there is so much nuance and so much context to everything they say. And they truly believe they don't have the answers, while they're probably far closer to having the actual answers than most people you're going to encounter. But it is unfortunately something that I do see a lot. And I would advise, again, if I were talking to a young strength coach or a young coach in general, is to not let it freeze you. Yes, you can't have the answers. It's impossible to have the answers. Nobody has them. But you try to get as close as possible. Get as close as possible to being able to implement whatever is best towards driving your desired goal or the organization's desired goal or the athlete's desired goal. And if you gather all this information and you let it freeze you, then you're of no good to anyone, basically, right? So, yes, be critical. Yes, ask yourself questions. Yes, surround yourself with critical thinkers, but also be realistic, if that makes sense.
There's just so much to unpack, and Yoeri and I have probably talked since the beginning of this year. Yoeri and I have talked no less than 10 hours on the topic of basketball, and he's helped me tremendously in analyzing the biases of my thinking, and has been critical with some of the things I post on social in a good way. That's been helpful for me, and very thankful to have met you this year. And thank you so much for your time. I literally feel like we could talk for 4 or 5 more hours, but to respect your time, we're just going to end it here. And I hope we have a part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. I agree. I feel like I've learned a ton from you over the past year from the conversations. I still suck at basketball, so don't hire this guy as a skills coach, because our conversations have not worked. Or I don't really understand how that works in general.
Yeah.
No, thanks for having me on, and definitely let's get a part 2 going.